Welcome back to A Bite from the Money Sandwich, where we provide practical and easy to understand tips and ideas on how to manage your money better, so as to let you retire with comfort and on your own terms. More people become millionaires through property than through any other type of investment. It's why you need to gain the knowledge, use the experts, and understand what the wealthy have been teaching their children for generations about good debt and leveraging. So I'm pleased to say I'm joined by Rich Harvey, who is the CEO and founder of Property Buyer. He's going to help provide valuable insights when buying property, what to look out for, what the trends and pitfalls are, so you can be that much better prepared when buying your next property. Well, welcome, Rich, to the show.
Great to be on the show, Mark. Pleasure.
Okay, I think probably I'm just trying to think where we first met, and I was probably that Sky Property News show that was
probably on one of the media outlets, and then we met also again at one of the property expos. I think you came along to meet me and heard one of my speeches there.
Yes, that's right. And so I've heard you speak a number of times on property and where the trends are. So it'd be great just to get your insights today. But it's probably worthwhile. Well, how did you actually get into this? Has it always been property? Where did you first start?
Well, for me, where did I first start? I mean, I started investing in property, 25, maybe 30 years ago. I worked in government for about 10 years as a principal economist. Actually did a background in environmental economics and did that for a while. And I started investing in property on the side while I was working there. And I really the goal for me was to just, make sustainable wealth and sustainable platform for my family. I basically wanted a situation that when I had kids, that my wife wouldn't have to feel compelled to go out to work. And I'd read a lot of books and a lot of study. And so I started to investigate this whole property investment idea as a way to create wealth. And I went to speak to a lot of financial planners and I went to a lot of events, but I couldn't find anyone that would really just give independent property advice. There's very, very few people around that gave that advice. So I kind of was self-taught in the early stages. And then I started buying investment properties and started teaching people at my workplace how to buy properties. And I remember the HR lady, she looked at my payslip one day. She said, "Rich, how do you pay no tax?" And I said, "Well, there's an old thing, the old section 221D, where you get the tax withholding variations." And I said, I'm able to claim my depreciation in advance. And they go, "Oh, that's clever. How do you do that?" So I was able to start teaching people and realize, gosh, there's a real niche in the market here to advise people. And I got a little bit frustrated in my job because it just wasn't, I was a bit sick of the politics and that sort of thing. So I ended up jumping out of that and starting my own buyer's agency. So that was actually just over 20 years ago. So 20 years ago, almost to the month.
And just some things just never change. Like as you said, the 221D, I remember saying to people, just for your cash flow, rather than wait to the end of the year for your tax deduction, you can actually get that through your tax return on a weekly or fortnightly basis. So, and exactly. Still applicable. So actually one thing you did say, which I really liked, was the independence. And we've seen spruikers, property spruikers for 50 years, and they're out there and they're selling, as we've had this, the whole land package, the mortgage, they'll do everything. But unfortunately, there's been so many people burnt, and just to have someone, as you said, independent is so important.
That's right. Well, for me, it was like, unfortunately, a lot of groups are getting, very large backhanders, $20, $30, $40, even $50,000 paid. And you won't know about that as an unsuspecting consumer unless you ask or unless you do some investigation. So I think it's pretty unfair that people don't know what the incentives are for people to sell you a property. And it didn't really sit right with me to be a selling agent. It just never sat right with me. I'm not going to sell something to someone that doesn't work for them. And I think a lot of those spruikers, they're a one size fits all. It's like, hey, you want wealth creation? That's your goal. That's a product. Well, buy my little overpriced unit here in Brisbane, or my house and land package in the 50 kilometres from town. And, unfortunately, those people that bought those properties, they stagnated for 8 to 10 years and have gone nowhere. And they're only now just starting to get their head above water. So I think you've got to be really careful to ask who you get advice from.
Yeah. And I think what you said about that with those property packages, and you find those huge unit blocks that popped up where 90% were investors. And I presume that must be one of the things, your criteria to help people is that, well, how much of this is an investor unit, a block of units, or is there at least a lot of owner occupiers as well as a few investors?
Yeah, well, that's a good point. When we're looking into a suburb, you don't really want to buy in a suburb that's got like 50% investor stock in that suburb. We like to buy in areas where there's a high percentage of owner occupiers, 70 or 80%, because it's those owner occupiers that help to stabilize the market. So if we ever do have a downturn, which we probably will have at some point, and then another upswing, during the downturns, the homeowners tend to hold on to their properties and don't panic sell, whereas it's the investors that will panic sell, and that will deplete the value of your own property. So, and also the owner occupiers tend to look after their properties a bit better. There's a bit more house proud, and the gardens are tidier, everything's cleaner, and a better demographic in those areas. So that's yet another reason to buy in higher percentage owner occupier areas.
So actually, we probably jump right in. We have jumped right in. Probably actually would be worthwhile. What does actually a property advocate? You have your own property advocacy business, which is basically covers most of Australia. But what actually does a property advocate do?
So a buyer's advocate or buyer's agent, Mark, is just someone who represents the buyer in the transaction. They're 100% independent. They only get fees from the buyer, and they're basically on the buyer's side to help them on the whole journey. So whether it's a home buyer, an investor, or commercial buyer, what we do is 7 things. We help them create what we call a property brief or a property strategy. We have a discussion, just like you would do with your financial planning clients. You understand their background, their backstory, what their goals and objectives are. So we have a discussion around that. And from that discussion, we create a strategy and create a brief. Then we give the clients some information on the target suburbs that we're looking at. So they've got a real idea of what their money can afford to buy in that particular area. And then we start searching for individual properties within that locality. And we'll start to shortlist. So my team will go out, inspect the property, provide a shortlist to the client. If they're a local client, we'll take them and do the inspection with them. If they're interstate, we'll do photos and videos or walkthroughs through WhatsApp and show them information about the property. Then we crunch some numbers and do some due diligence. So we identify if it's an investor, we'll tell them the rent, and work out what the cash flow will be. If they're an owner occupier, we'll look at all the features and make sure it matches up to their brief. Then we also just check if there's any surrounding issues, like if it's overshadowed by DAs or overshadowed by some other problem, just make sure it's a safe investment. Then we appraise the value of the property. And this is where we really come into our own, be giving that really true advice on what is the property actually worth in today's market. Because the market's constantly changing, Mark. I mean, last year, price guides were a bit of a joke in 2021. Prices were going 10 to 15, 20% above guide. But as the market cools, the price guides are going to be a bit more accurate. And if we have a downturn, we'll be able to get discounts again. So you've got to know how to pitch the property to get it. So we're very skilled at appraising and then negotiating. And having a buyer's advocate, buyer's agent, on your side just removes all of that emotion out of that negotiating process. And then the last 2 steps is just confirming the contractual arrangements. We liaise with the solicitor to negotiate any special conditions on the contract. And then we either attend auction or do a private treaty negotiation for the client, get the property exchanged or executed to become unconditional. And then the last step, if they're an investor, we help them find a local property manager. So in a nutshell, it's a full end-to-end process from buying, working out a brief to actually securing a property and doing handover at the end.
And importantly, as you said right at the front, you just charge a fee for your service for that.
Absolutely. Yeah, we work on a fixed fee basis, so there's no surprises. So the fees anywhere between 1.5% to 2% and an engagement fee of $3,000 to $5,000 depending on the budget. But it's an investment in a lot of things, Mark. It's an investment in knowledge. It's an investment in time saving. It's an investment in getting the right quality of product, the right quality of property, I should say, that's going to look after yourself for the long term. Because it's a real false economy to try and penny pinch on getting advice. I've found, myself, I pay my advisors really well because I value what I don't know. So it's really important to get that person on your side.
Yeah, and I think from one of those points you made there, the fee, yes, while there is a fee, a lot of it is when you negotiate the fee for the price of the house or unit or townhouse, for example, you can either get that back or at the other end, make sure they don't pay too much.
Exactly. Well, obviously, during a boom market, you're not going to get discounts. We had clients saying, oh, look, I want to get it for 10% on the market. And we were just really honest and say, well, that's not going to happen, right? But if you buy a quality property in a rising market, property prices are rising 2.5%, 3.5%, 4% a month. So if we're charging 1.5%, 2%, you've more than made up your money in a month, So, but over the course of a year, the average long-term price of property, capital growth, is around 7% in the capital cities of Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. So for me, it's just about, holding on. Property is not a short-term play. Generally, it's a longer-term play. There's a lot of fees. Obviously, stamp duty is a big one, and agents' fees another one. So it's really important that investors and home buyers take a longer-term view on property acquisition.
Yeah. And, as I said, you're seeing people, especially in the last year or so, paying too much for property because, that FOMO, fear of missing out, and wanting to actually get in. There must be other classic mistakes you see people make that, trying to do it on their own. What for some other possible examples you could give?
Yeah, great question. The classic mistakes, there's plenty of them. The one I call is the frustrated purchase. This is more for the home buyer, where they've been out every weekend for 6 months. They've dragged the kids around with them. They're screaming in the back. They're throwing tantrums, and they're just over it. And the wife looks at the husband and said, "Come on, darling, we just have to buy the next property we see." And they make an offer, they buy it, and then they realise they've made a big mistake because it's a substandard property. They're just trying to put an end to their pain of searching. And then they've got to move out in 12 months when they have another kid, right? So don't become a frustrated buyer. Another one for investors is they don't crunch the numbers properly. They don't do any assessment of the capital growth drivers or the rent drivers for a local area. And they just get sold on some pretty weak advice as to why it's a good area. So it's really important to understand the numbers when you're buying investment properties. Another one for investors is thinking they're just going to make money overnight. Buying properties, as I say, a long-term process. And some investors get really impatient about buying properties and seeing a result. And they ring me up a year later and say, "Hey, Rich, it hasn't grown in value." And I'm saying, you've got to hold on for a 7 to 10 year period. It's really important to be patient because sometimes, like we've seen the last 2 years, we get a huge spurt of growth. And then we have years where it's going to flatline or slightly decline. So it's really important to have that longer term perspective and hold that property and make sure you've got your mindset on a longer term view. And another one for home buyers as well is they freak out about a negative pest and building report. You've got to get a pest and building inspection done by an independent builder, but they'll read the report, and those reports are written in a very negative way because they highlight every little thing that's wrong with the property, right? But you shouldn't ditch the property if it's got a cracked tile or one little bowed floorboard. Little things like that can be repaired. What I'm looking for myself, if it's a no deal, is major structural damage or major termite infestation. So just be aware of how much the repair would cost rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah, no, that's good points. And one of the things I really like what you're saying about the long-term view. You are seeing people who, they're if they buy that property and they're renting it out as investment, they're looking at sales every 3-6 months to see, well, how's my property going? It's just going to give you an ulcer.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
So we're hearing a lot, especially of what's going on in seeing 20-30% increases in some of the major cities, and looking at the trends. You're getting a lot of experts sort of saying, "Oh, okay, this is going to go on forever," and then the next day you're going to hear an expert saying, "Oh no, you're going to expect a crash. We're going to have negative. Your property is going to drop in the next." Where do you see the market is at the moment?
Great question. Well, the simple answer is there's no one answer. I can't give you a cliche to say the market's hot, cold, warm, right? Last year, I can tell you it was hot. We know it was hot because property prices rose around 30% in Sydney, around 15% in Melbourne and 25% in Brisbane. But where the market is right at this moment in early 2022, we're seeing that the Sydney market is holding fairly steady. We're still seeing high demand for high quality properties, but we are seeing a little bit of a tapering off. So the rate of growth, the peak of the market, like when it was growing at a really strong rate, and we were seeing 3 to 4% a month rises, that's gone. We're not seeing that. The latest figures from CoreLogic actually show that it's fairly stable now. We're getting a lot more listings coming on the market. Right. There's less bidders at auction, but properties are still trading very well. So we haven't seen any major price declines yet. And that won't come until we get about 3, maybe 4 interest rate rises later in the year or early next year. Melbourne, different story. Melbourne's still very strong. We're still seeing very strong positive growth, shortage of listings there, and strong attendance at auction. In Brisbane, it's actually a hot market still. Not white hot like it was last year, but still a hot market. Some of my team are telling me there's 50 groups lined up outside a house, right? So
Yeah.
very, very strong demand. And with the floods in there recently, it's just going to get worse because there's going to be even higher demand for property with all the damage that's been done up there. So that Brisbane market, a lot of interstate migration, we're going to see strong demand. So I think overall the market at the moment is coming off its peak, it's tapering, but every city has a different level.
Okay, there's 2 points you've made there that I wouldn't mind going a bit further into. One was the interest rates, and the second is population migration. So just on the interest rates, you're even saying maybe 3 or 4 interest rates possibly this year. I know, they've all been revised, and there's definitely in the second half of the year going to be interest rate rises. But just so not to freak out people listening, we're not talking about, interest rates are going to double. We're not going to see 6, 8, 10% interest rates. Where do you see, or what have you heard?
So, well, my view, I'm an economist by training as well. I think the new, what they call neutral cash rate, will probably be around about 1.25%. So we're currently sitting at 0.1%. I was tipping that we'd have a first rate rise in November, but I think it might be slightly earlier. It's just going to depend on what happens with wages and what happens with overall inflation. And the Reserve Bank, if you read their statement that just came out again yesterday, they've repeatedly says they're being patient and they won't move on rates until they can see both inflation and wages well above the range that they're comfortable with. So we're still in expansionary repair mode for the economy. And they've noticed also that they've noted that the property market is starting to cool. So that's good for them. So they don't have to do as much drawing back. So I think, we may get, 2, maybe 3 rate rises of 0.25 or 0.15 later in the year, and that will slow the market, but it's not the death knell for investors at all. It's just for me, I love it because it spells opportunity. More buyers sit on the bench, I've got more opportunity to buy well in that time.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, when's a good time to buy? It's the same way, I believe, for shares and all that. At the end of the day, you've just got to be in the market and then give yourself a long-term view. So I presume, even though it might have been prior to the huge price rises last year to have gotten in before then, but now there's still going to be opportunities, as you just said, to be able to buy good quality properties.
Yeah, I think if people are asking the question, when's a good time to buy? For me, the answer is quite simple, is when your circumstances allow you to buy. If you're buying or selling and buying in the same market, it doesn't really make much difference as a home buyer. As an investor, if you try to time your entry and exit into the market, it's like being an Olympic diver. As I say, you're trying to do a triple plank somersault, reverse tilt, and make sure there's no splash, right? Pretty hard to do, right?
Yes.
It's much better to buy when you've got borrowing capacity because people's circumstances and jobs can change very quickly. And if you've got borrowing capacity and they're good income, use it. A lot of people have what I call lazy equity sitting in their properties, and they've got income capacity and do nothing about it. I mean, you must see this every day of the week, Mark. People who've got the ability to create wealth and establish a financial future, but do nothing about it. So I guess coming back to your question, timing of the market, and again, just whatever the market conditions, if it is cooling or rising, you can still pay fair market value and do very, very well. I mean, I'm literally buying myself at the moment. So I don't have any fear about the market going backward. I'm still buying right now myself.
Yeah, and it's one of the things we do teach our clients, or when we do coaching, is good debt versus bad debt. There's a lot of people and parents tell children, don't get into debt, don't get in over your head. And you just need to separate that bad debt, credit cards, easy money, against lifestyle assets, for example, clothes or such, whereas good debt, buying against good quality income producing assets, which will grow over time, is great. You've got an asset there, you're using debt the way it should be used. And it is what, the Rich Dad, Poor Dad, Robert Kiyosaki just goes on about this. It's what the wealthy teach their kids, generation after generation, how to use debt to buy good quality assets.
Absolutely. And look, the point about you make about debt there, leverage. It's once I learned this principle of leverage, I bought 3 properties in my first year. Once someone showed me through a simple spreadsheet, how do you buy property safely? How do you leverage safely? Because you can leverage $1 5 times. I mean, the banks lend you 80% loan to value ratio, right? So I'd much rather use the bank's money than my own money and have, more opportunity, more exposure to an asset class that I know is going to grow and be sustainable in the long term. So leverage can be done very, very well. It's great.
Yeah, and to the point that, it used to always be, oh, negative gearing, yet allow the government to provide you a tax deduction. But negative gearing was only if the rent didn't basically cover the interest on the loans. But what we're seeing is interest rates are all-time low, even if there is going to be some slight increases later in the year. People are positively geared. The rent is actually covering the loan, which is unheard of.
Even in Sydney, I mean, even if you've got a yield of 3% and you're borrowing at 2%, you've still got a 1% buffer to cover your costs and other things, I mean, obviously a lot of the higher value properties, it's hard to get a good yield, but yeah, we're seeing incredible opportunities to buy positive cash flow all over the place and do that regularly for our clients.
We can talk about this particular topic in the cash flow and although the ability, especially for investing, but it's actually probably going to the other part of what you were talking about, which was property migration, because not only moving, like that's one thing I've really learned from going to a lot of property seminars and research is you can nearly see when Sydney is too expensive and people are moving out, going to places like Brisbane, then you see that 4 or 5 year lag time when Brisbane is up, then you see Sydney basically booming again. But what we've really seen is now this whole rent vesting. I'm not going to be able to buy my own first home in Sydney anymore. And I've got a lifestyle I like in the city or something similar, but I'm going to rent, but invest elsewhere, whether that's in the country, whether it's in Brisbane or where it's somewhere else, or even have the sea change. So you must have seen those type of trends a lot the last couple of years.
Oh, 100%, Mark. And we've helped dozens, hundreds of clients literally with that particular strategy. I know a lot of people that have divorced or separated, and so they've split the assets and they're having to start again and they can't afford to buy in Sydney or Melbourne. So they're just simply going the rent vesting strategy. Also, a lot of younger people that can't afford to buy in the major Sydney or Melbourne markets. Again, rent vesting is a great strategy. So it just simply means that you rent near where you work and live and want to have a great social life and where you've got all your connections. And then you invest in an area that's going to provide long-term capital growth and good cash flow in the meantime. So it just means you've got a stake in the market. So rent vesting is a great strategy. And to your point about migration too, the other big trend we've seen that COVID really accelerated, it was already happening, but this exodus or flight to affordable lifestyle. A lot of people are moving to the Central Coast, to Newcastle, Sunshine Coast, Gold Coast, all those kind of coastal areas that are a couple of hours away from the major cities now, where they're still within striking distance, but they don't need to commute every day. It might be they only go to the city 1 or 2 days a week if required. Yes. So those coastal regions have really shot up, and that trend I think will continue.
Okay, and I totally agree. We've seen that. Even the company I'm with, their staff are only coming back 1 or 2 days a week, and even though they can come back into the city, if they don't need to, why should they? So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this goes the next couple of years, this working from home. Okay, so one of the things, and I actually also see from a lot of millennials and parents helping their millennial adult children, they want that lifestyle in a city, for example, but also seeing from a lot of millennials at Gen X, Gen Ys, is that traditionally, my generation or older had that one career. So they could be in the one spot for their whole lifetime and therefore have that settled roots, their home. Whereas some children now, our adult children, are saying, well, no, maybe we have 3, 4 careers, may not be in Sydney, it may be in overseas. So why do we want to be tied down to a home? So this whole rent vesting is working out well. And I'm just fascinated to see how this trend continues. But it has led to a really good question in seeing how do parents help their adult children into the property market. We've seen people either through their super or they're downsizing, they've got spare cash, they don't want to wait till they pop off this earth to be able to transfer that wealth. Can we help with our kids with a deposit? Because for a lot of adult children, you must see that they actually can afford the loan. It's getting that 10 or 20% deposit, 50, 100, 200,000 is so hard to do. So how can parents do it? And I must admit, I will go on to about bank guarantors, because for your own home, that's very different rules to if you're bank guarantoring a business, for example. So what's your view on that for parents?
Yeah, great question. So we are also seeing a lot of parents in their 50s and 60s really wanting to help their kids crack into the property market. And like you say, it's taking 5 years or 6 years sometimes to save up that 100 grand or 150 or 200K deposit, whatever they need to get into the market. Equally, we've also seen the parents dish out cash or dish out an equity loan to help their kids get in. There was an article, some research, I think, last year that I read. It was that the average loan from the bank of mum and dad was around about 90,000. I don't know how accurate that was, but it was in the Fin Review. I remember reading it last year. But yeah, I'm in the same boat. I'm looking how I can help my kids get into the property market. And we have lots of discussions around property around the dinner table, as you can imagine, and encouraging them to, not save for a jet ski, but save for a deposit, right?
Yeah.
Because it's very easy for them. If you give them cash, they could just spend it on something that's not there. So I think one incentive that I'm going to do with my kids is say, look, if you can save up 100 grand, I'll match that. So then you'll have 200. So I'm going to set a benchmark and say, look, I want you to save. I'm not just going to give you the money. I'm going to loan them the money, and I'll do it through a limited equity guarantee on our home. So that way, as a limited amount, I'm not exposing my whole home. And I think anyone should get financial advice, Mark, around this strategy. So they're not exposing, or guaranteeing a business. They're just guaranteeing a property, which is a much safer investment in my view. So I think it's a great strategy, and I think it's the only way that a lot of younger people will actually be able to afford to get into the market. Otherwise, if they've got to wait another 7 years, hey, the market might have increased another 30, 40, 50%. And that's just continually being too far away from them to be able to actually get into the market.
It's very hard to save that deposit, and when that property value is always moving away from you. And from what I heard, even for bank guarantors, if you're the parent, it's not like if it's a $500,000 loan and you're helping them with 100,000 that you're now bank guarantoring the whole 500,000.
No.
You're guarantoring what the percentage the bank asks you to for the extra.
That's right. Yeah. And I think there's many ways to structure it. So just get both good financial advice from your planner like yourself or a broker and the lender, but you can limit the amount of your exposure. So you can choose to actually loan that amount to your child. You might do it interest-free. You might charge them interest. You might do it as a living will. You might gift it to them at some point, but I mean, they're going to end up with it eventually. So, but you got to decide what's the right incentive. But I'm very big on not so much a silver spoon approach, but creating incentives. It's a bit like for your staff. If you give people something too much, they get an entitlement mentality. So I think it's very important to be, structure it the right way so there's a good incentive to save and be smart with your money.
Yeah, I think exactly that entitlement mentality. One of the things we suggest, for example, is actually put this in paper. Get this in writing, put down the amount, put down a repayment, and yeah, you said it could be zero interest. It's whatever you want to do, but at least put the signature to it, your commitment to this, rather than this is just here's this gift, and the child doesn't really ever expect to repay it. So no, I think that's important. So one of the other things you see that's sort of trending, or that's people you're seeing in the property market to help their kids, or any other thing that property that you'd see, the trends that you would like to comment on?
Not so much I think with one thing I'd say about parents helping their kids is just to make sure if you're a first-time buyer or getting into the market, that you've really got realistic expectations. I think some parents and also some kids, if you've grown up in Mossman, you might have particular tastes, right? But you're not going to get the Taj Mahal in your first property, right? So just all I'd say is, don't expect to get the be-all and end-all property or forever home in your first property. You might have to pull up your sleeves and scrub down some walls and repaint, right? There might be some renos you've got to do. But the key thing is get a foot on the property ladder. Don't expect a beautiful, perfectly renovated property for $1 million. You've just got to be a bit humble about it and work out where you can afford to buy, and then go ahead and get into the market when you can.
Really good point. One of the things actually I did realize when you said before was that having a specialist work out the possible way of doing this. I really like using mortgage brokers as well, because
Absolutely.
They're specialists. They're more strategists for your mortgage or your debt, rather than if you go to a bank, they'll have 5 different loans. You choose the one you want. Whereas I think that's probably becoming more and more important.
Yeah. I think the other thing sort of tip I'd give to Mark for anyone looking to buy a home or investment is just sit down and work out what it is that's going to work for your situation. Like if you're a home buyer, a lot of people don't know how to compromise. They think they've got to have the perfect home, and they just go spin their wheels endlessly every weekend. Yeah. And they might be looking for 12 months. And if you were looking for 12 months last year, the market might have got away from you and you might be completely priced out of a suburb. So there's certain essential and desirable criteria you've got to write down, work out, okay, what can't I compromise on? What can I compromise on? So, for me, if I've got my money, I want to get the best location, the best position I can with my property, and then add value to that property. So a lot of people turn their nose up at, stinky carpets or bad colors on the walls or old blinds. Don't worry about that stuff. That's just all cosmetic. Look beyond the cosmetic and look at the slope of the land, the aspect, distance to shops, to transport, and the land size. All of those things are far more important than the actual building itself, which can be repaired or even knocked down and rebuilt at some point in the future.
And that's always been the number one tip forever. I've ever read property is always location, location, location. So I think, if what you just said there emphasizes that. Well, Rich, I've kept you long enough, but one of the things I always like to ask our people coming onto this show is a final bite, best piece of advice they've ever heard, whether, it's from your parents, financial, or just life advice. Is there something that that you've heard that you've stuck by?
Yeah, great. I love this question. I was anticipating you asking this. And I was thinking back to when I was in my teenage years, and my dad always taught me to save. And I sort of learnt the idea or the art of delayed gratification. And, I would save up, like when I was a kid, I used to love technical Lego, and I'd do some gardening jobs and save up and then go and buy my little toy. And it was like a reward. So I think if you can save in buckets, so what I mean by that is have a holiday account, have a property investment deposit account, have maybe a future education fund for your kids. Like, save more than you spend. Don't spend more than you earn, and save in buckets, and actually set a goal each year to go, you know what, I'm going to cut down on my consumption of whatever, coffee, lollies, chocolate, going out, and just be smart with your money. And that's savings, and watching that grow, and then just executing on, you've got that money in your account, now let's go and spend it on what we agreed we're going to spend it on, and enjoy that holiday, enjoy buying that investment property. So for me, it was having, that savings approach and having a structured idea of, I've got money allocated to different buckets. That for me has worked really well.
Yeah, excellent. And I think especially for a lot of young adults, just starting out in the workforce, that works perfectly.
And you got to reward yourself, I think. I think a lot of people think, it's all really, I'm going to this financial planner, he's going to tell me to save everything and not enjoy life. No, the whole idea, right, is that if you save well, you can enjoy a bit now and even more later. But if you try to buy everything now and live your life on bad credit, you're going to tie yourself up in knots.
Yeah, and probably even worse, what we've found, especially because there is so much access to easy money now, is they don't actually have a control or understanding of where all their money goes. They live paycheck to paycheck, and they just wonder, where did all that money go? It's just too easy with a tap and go mentality. So it's very
the last tip, if I can give one more, can I give a second one, Mark? So a second one is invest in yourself, right? Okay. Invest in your education and your future earning capacity. So for me, I did an economics degree, then I went back to uni and did a master's, and then I did a diploma of property. I'm continually learning. I've done a multitude of courses. So, and the more education you get, the more employable and the more skillful you get. But I spent a huge amount of money on property investment courses, and that was fantastic for me because that really set me up for success in knowing what to look for and what mistakes to avoid. So investing in yourself through education is another great way to set yourself up financially.
I think that's a nice way to finish it. Knowledge is power, as they say, self-education, really important. Rich, really appreciate your time today. That's been some gold nuggets there, and I'm sure the people listening will really appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks to be on the show, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you'd like to know more about Rich or interested in their buyers advocacy services, visit propertybuyer.com.au. Also, feel free to either email me at admin@themoneysandwich.com or visit our website, themoneysandwich.com, if you have any questions or would like to learn more. Enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of A Bite from the Money Sandwich? Make sure you subscribe on your platform of choice so you can automatically receive each episode as soon as it's released. As with every podcast, this information is not advice, as not personalized to your own situation. And past performance is never guaranteed for the future. What we are trying to do here is to provide tips, coaching, and education to help improve your money knowledge, which we believe can only be a good thing. See you next time when we take another bite from the Money Sandwich.